Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. By the winter of 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province had become the heavy hinge of Australia's war in Vietnam. It wasn't the biggest slice of the country, and it wasn't the place that made politicians point at maps for cameras, but it mattered in a way that only soldiers and supply officers truly understood. Phuoc Tuy sat across the veins, those narrow jungle routes that linked quiet coastal landing points to inland command areas and hidden depots. Whoever controlled this province controlled movement, controlled secrecy, controlled the ability to decide when violence happened and on whose terms. At the center of it all stood Nui Dat, home of the 1st Australian Task Force. If you imagine the American bases you've seen in footage, wide runways, endless tents, bright lights, the whole machine of a modern army, Nui Dat was the opposite by design. It didn't try to dominate the landscape, it tried to blend into it, sandbag positions, low profiles, a perimeter that felt more like a cautious boundary than a statement. It was built to be functional, quiet, and hard to locate from a distance. The Australians weren't trying to look invincible, they were trying to look absent, and their method in Phuoc Tuy followed that same logic. While American units nearby often leaned on big sweeps, helicopter mobility, and thunderous search and destroy operations that crashed through an area and moved on, the Australians pursued control through constant pressure. The slow, grinding kind that doesn't make headlines, but changes the map anyway. They cleared an exclusion zone around Nui Dat, forcing villages away from the immediate area and denying the Viet Cong the easiest advantage of all, blending into civilian life like smoke. Then they did something even more unsettling for the enemy. They flooded the jungle with small patrols, day after day, night after night. Infantry and SAS elements moved through scrub, rubber plantations, creeks, and narrow tracks, laying ambushes where a courier might pass, watching trails that didn't appear on any Western map, and quietly ripping threads out of the enemy's supply web. There were no dramatic victory photos, no towering body counts, just a creeping sense for anyone on the other side that the ground was becoming unsafe in ways you couldn't predict. The Americans could be loud and episodic. An operation would roar in, churn the jungle, then fade away. The Australians were different. They stayed. They returned to the same ground until it wasn't unfamiliar anymore. They learned the terrain at a granular level, the bend in a trail where boots always slowed, the subtle cut of a path that meant it had been used yesterday, the way certain birds went silent when a group moved under the canopy. Over time, things began to happen to the Viet Cong that felt almost supernatural if you didn't know the cause. Supply caches vanished, couriers didn't arrive, units were hit in places they'd always considered safe. What had been contested territory began to feel like a shrinking trap. The Australians weren't winning by spectacle, they were winning by erosion, the steady wearing down of the enemy's freedom to move, hide, and breathe. By mid-1966, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese commanders decided they couldn't tolerate it any longer. As long as Nui Dat functioned, the pressure would only tighten. And pressure, if left alone, does one of two things. It collapses or it bursts. So they chose to burst it. Not with harassment, not with symbolic sniping, not with a few rounds tossed at the wire for propaganda. This would be decisive. The base had to be struck hard enough to shatter the system it represented, hard enough to make the Australians doubt their method, doubt the ground, doubt their control. Plans were drawn quietly. Forces were concentrated beyond the usual guerrilla pattern. Main force units, real regiments, began to gather in silence, waiting for the moment when the Australians would do what they always did, because the enemy understood Australian doctrine, and they planned to use it against them. The quiet war in Phuoc Tuy was about to become very loud. It began on the night of August 17, 1966. At approximately 2:43 a.m., Nui Dat's routine snapped like a wire under tension. Mortar rounds dropped into the base. Recoilless rifle fire cracked. Shells slammed into the perimeter in quick succession. Over 80 rounds punching into bunkers, tearing through tent lines, ripping the night open in violent flashes. Men woke to the sound of dirt and sandbags being shredded. The air filled with that ugly combination of cordite and damp earth. Shouts collided with the thump of impacts. Somewhere a stretcher team started moving before anyone even finished counting the wounded. And then, almost as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The jungle swallowed the attackers the way it always did. Counter-battery procedures fired into suspected positions, but the night gave nothing back. If you were inside Nui Dat, it would have felt like a sharp, nasty lesson and nothing more. Enemy mortars, fire and displacement, textbook hit and run. But what mattered wasn't the damage, it was what came next. Australian doctrine after a mortar attack was clear. Patrol out at first light, find firing points, track the crew, hit them before they could regroup. The Viet Cong counted on that. They didn't merely expect it, they needed it. Because the mortar attack wasn't meant to destroy Nui Dat, it was meant to pull Australians into the field, into a place already shaped into a battlefield. In the darkness beyond the wire, the real force lay concealed. They held fire, they listened, they waited. A trap doesn't have to sprint, a trap only has to be patient. On the morning of August 18th, Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment received the task. Major Harry Smith led 108 men out of Nui Dat to conduct what everyone assumed would be a routine sweep. They were relieving another company that had tracked through the night without finding surrounding the mortar crews. The mood wasn't reckless, it wasn't fearful, it was professional, almost mundane. Weapons were checked, loads were adjusted. A man tightened a strap, another reseated a magazine, someone cracked a dry joke that earned a tired grin. There was no sense of marching into a storm. It was a job they'd done before, a follow-up patrol intended to confirm enemy movement and return before evening. What none of them could see, what no report inside Nui Dat could reveal, was that beyond the tree line and scrub ahead, thousands of enemy troops were already in position. Main force regiments reinforced by local units lay silent, watching the Australians advance. The men of Delta Company weren't chasing a retreating mortar crew. They were walking into the center of a carefully prepared killing ground designed to turn Australian doctrine into a weapon against them. By late morning, Delta Company had pushed several kilometers east of Nui Dat, following faint tracks, small clues. Disturbed earth, a scuffed branch, the kind of signs you only notice when you've lived in the bush long enough to read it like handwriting. The terrain began to change. Dense scrub opened into the long tan geometry of a rubber plantation. Rows of evenly spaced trees like pillars, their trunks forming corridors of sight forward but creating deceptive angles and blind flanks. It looked open, it felt exposed, yet it behaved like a maze, a place where movement could be watched from 3 directions at once. And the monsoon season pressed down like a hand. The air was thick and still, heavy with humidity. Sweat clung to skin and webbing. Sound didn't travel normally, it seemed to die in the leaves or echo too close. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own footsteps, the small metallic click of a sling swivel. Hours passed with nothing but heat and dampness, and the steady discipline of the patrol. They found discarded mortar-based plates, clear signs of a hurried withdrawal. Everything on the surface matched expectation. Then shortly after 3:40 p.m., the silence broke. 11 platoon, positioned forward, sighted a small group of enemy soldiers moving through the trees. Khaki uniforms, disciplined posture. Not local part-time guerrillas, regular troops. Contact was made. Rifles cracked through the heavy air. The enemy pulled back almost immediately. To the Australians, it looked familiar. Scouts probed, were engaged, and withdrew. And doctrine said to pursue. Don't let them slip away. Don't let them lead you blind. So 11 platoon followed. And with that pursuit, they stepped into the heart of the ambush. Within minutes, the sky turned hostile. A monsoon storm arrived with sudden violence, as if someone had torn open a tank above the canopy. Rain hammered leaves and turned dust into slick red mud. Visibility collapsed, 50 meters at best, then less. Wind tore through the plantation and thunder rolled so close it felt like impact. Radio transmissions became a hiss of static. Commands were shouted, swallowed, shouted again. The world shrank into rain, noise, movement, and then through it all, the firing intensified. Not scattered shots, sustained automatic fire from multiple directions. 11 platoon reported heavy contact. Almost immediately, the tone changed. The kind of change you can hear in a voice over a radio, even through distortion. This wasn't a delaying action. This was a main force engagement. Enemy troops began to appear in numbers, emerging from rain and mist in organized formations, and then came the sounds that carried a message all on their own. Bugles and whistles, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through thunder. Coordinated assault signals. Major Harry Smith, monitoring from company headquarters, understood the gravity almost instantly. The patrol had transitioned from reconnaissance to survival. 11 platoon was pinned on a slight rise, being hammered and separated from the rest of the company by heavy fire. Attempts to maneuver drew immediate punishment. Then the report came. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp had been killed while directing his men. In moments, Delta Company's routine sweep became something else entirely. 3 hours of combat compressed into minutes under monsoon conditions against a force that vastly outnumbered them in terrain that offered no clean retreat. The trap had closed. As the storm raged over the rubber plantation near Long Tan, the scale of the fight became impossible to ignore. 11 platoon, having chased the initial contact, now held a shrinking patch of muddy ground under sustained assault. Waves of enemy infantry advanced through the gray curtain of rain, not scattered, not hesitant, but coordinated. Veteran troops from the Viet Cong 275th Regiment, reinforced by elements of the D445 Battalion, pressed in with a method that belonged to armies, not raiding parties. Later records would confirm that roughly 200 enemy soldiers were committed against a forward element of just 18 Australians. In that moment, numbers weren't an abstract statistic, they were a physical presence. Movement in the trees, shapes in the mist, an endless sense that the jungle contained more men than your rifle could ever stop. The enemy tried to envelop Delta Company using the plantation's geometry to mask flanking movement. Assault after assault surged forward, bugles, whistles, then the roar of automatic fire, the slap of rounds into trees and mud. The Australians answered with disciplined, controlled fire, each shot deliberate, conserving ammunition in a battle that was starting to feel like it had no end. With their platoon commander gone, leadership fell to Sergeant Bob Buick, who organized a tightening defensive perimeter around the wounded. Men lay prone in the mud, rifles pressed into shoulders, faces streaked with rain and red earth. Barrels heated, hands went numb. Every time an enemy wave fell back, another emerged through the downpour, as if the rain itself was spawning them. Then the enemy pushed close, deliberately. They wanted to neutralize the Australians' advantage, supporting fire. Get close enough that artillery couldn't be used without killing friend and foe alike. It was a ruthless idea, and it nearly worked. Major Smith made a decision that carried extraordinary risk. He requested artillery fire danger close. That meant high explosive shells landing within tens of meters of his own men, close enough that a small error could wipe out the very soldiers the fire was meant to save. It was a request you don't make unless the alternative is annihilation. Back at Nui Dat, gunners of the Australian 103 and 105 field batteries, alongside New Zealand's 161 battery, worked in appalling conditions. Rain-soaked uniforms and equipment, men shielded fuses under slouch hats. Gun crews loaded and fired with relentless rhythm, building a tempo that refused to break. Forward observer Captain Stanley, soaked, under fire, operating in a world of noise and static, adjusted missions in real time, walking the artillery closer and closer to the Australian perimeter. Shells burst in the trees and slammed into the ground, shredding enemy formations and creating a moving wall of steel. At times, rounds detonated just 30 to 50 meters from Australian positions. Shock waves rattled teeth, the air filled with the smell of cordite and splintered rubberwood. The artillery didn't just kill, it bought time. But time alone wasn't enough. Ammunition dwindled, magazines ran dry. Some men counted their remaining rounds the way a drowning man counts breaths. Others crawled under fire to strip ammunition from fallen comrades, hands shaking not from fear alone, but from exhaustion and the cold seep of monsoon rain. By late afternoon, the battle reached its most critical point. Delta Company had been engaged for more than 3 hours without pause. They were spent, soaked to the bone, shivering as the storm hammered the plantation. Enemy movement suggested a final coordinated push was forming, designed to break the perimeter before darkness made control impossible. Bugles sounded again, casualties mounted. The line held, but only just. At Nui Dat, commanders understood artillery might not carry them through the next assault. A relief force was ordered forward despite the weather and enemy presence. Leading it was 3-troop 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Adrian Roberts. 10 M113 armored personnel carriers began pushing toward Long Tan, grinding through mud, fighting flooded creeks and jungle tracks that were barely passable on good days. At one swollen stream, the vehicles were forced to swim across under fire, engines straining as water poured into hatches and vision blocks, crews hunched low as rounds snapped and cracked around them. It was the kind of movement that feels slow from the inside and impossibly fast to anyone watching it happen. Then the APCs hit the plantation. They didn't creep in cautiously. They charged into the enemy flank with the blunt confidence of armor that knows infantry is dying nearby. .50 caliber machine guns opened up, ripping through rubber trees and the advancing formations beyond them. The effect was immediate. Viet Cong troops without effective anti-armor weapons were caught exposed. Some tried to run, some froze, some were cut down, and others scattered into the rain and jungle. At approximately 6 p.m., the APCs broke into the Australian perimeter. For the exhausted men of Delta Company, the sight was transformative. Armored shapes emerging from the storm like something unreal, heavy weapons thundering, engines growling, crews shouting over the noise. Relief didn't arrive as a quiet handshake. It arrived as overwhelming firepower and moving steel. The relief force formed a defensive ring. Their weapons added weight to the battered infantry line. Faced with artillery, armor, and a cohesive defensive position that refused to collapse, Viet Cong commanders finally ordered a withdrawal. Under cover of darkness and heavy rain, enemy forces melted back into the jungle the way they had always tried to, quietly, efficiently, leaving the plantation littered with the evidence of a fight they had expected to win. Strategically, Long Tan changed everything. The Australian task force's reputation hardened into something the enemy couldn't ignore. American commanders took notice, not of spectacle, but of discipline. Not of noise, but of method. In that sodden rubber plantation, the Australians had proven what their entire approach in Phuoc Tuy had been trying to demonstrate all along. They would stay, they would return, they would not abandon their wounded, and they could hold ground against odds that should have crushed them. For the enemy, the lesson was equally clear. After Long Tan, Phuoc Tuy was no longer safe ground. The slow erosion the Australians practiced had teeth, and when it was tested by a main force blow meant to shatter it, it didn't break. Long Tan became more than a battle. It became a standard.